and welcome once again. We're continuing on our series on Aliyah, on return, and the grand story of the return of the Jewish people to the land and to the heart of God. And of course, circle expands beyond that. Ultimately, the journey of return is a journey for all of us, and not just the Jewish people. We are all journeying towards God's purposes. And as it says in the book of John, that the Father is gathering his banished people, his banished children, home. And that's really where we're all headed, home, to be with the Lord, to be with him forever, to enter into all his original intentions for us, and even beyond that, I believe. We can't even imagine the wonderful things God has in store for us. So this is the third session, and we've been moving slowly, looking first at the lives of the patriarchs and their return stories. Last week, we looked at Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And this week, we're going to look at the life of Joseph, because Joseph also has a return story. And one of the things you'll notice as I'm doing this, of course, we're drawing the parallels between the stories of the patriarchs and the nation of Israel. But also, of course, and you see this especially with Joseph and also with Isaac very, very strongly, that all the patriarchs, in a sense, also echo the life of Yeshua, and they foreshadow his ministry. And you can look at, for instance, Joseph, and we're going to look at Joseph as he relates to the people of Israel, the nation, but of course you can also look through the lens of Yeshua and see the parallels there. And what I've noticed in the scriptures is sometimes the echo, the story of the people of Israel and the story of Yeshua, they very much dovetail, don't they? And there is tremendous correspondence between Yeshua and the nation. And this really shouldn't surprise us, because Yeshua is the king of Israel. He's the head of the nation. And so, for instance, in the book of Isaiah, there's always this clash going on between Christians and Orthodox Jews about who the servant of the Lord is in the book of Isaiah. And we say it's Jesus, and they say, no, it's Israel. And actually, it's a silly argument, because when you read carefully in the book of Isaiah, sometimes it's very clear that the servant of the Lord is Israel. In fact, it says clearly, Israel, my servant. But there are times as well when we're reading about this servant in Isaiah that this one gives his life for Israel. This one is the one who gathers Israel. And I really don't think it's saying that Israel gives its life for itself and Israel gathers itself. I mean, it's very clear from the language that it's the agency of the servant on behalf of Israel. And we know that that's the Messiah. But you have this almost an ambiguity in Isaiah about who the servant is, because there is such a meshing between who Yeshua is and who Israel is. And the point is, we are not to disconnect Yeshua from Israel and Israel from Yeshua. In fact, you can't really do that. And the life of the nation and the life of the Messiah, in many ways, parallel and connect. And that's why we read in Matthew chapter 2, where Matthew says, this is to fulfill what the prophet said, out of Egypt I have called my son. And you're scratching your head when you read in Hosea about that passage, because it's not talking about the Messiah, it's talking about the nation coming out of Egypt. But there is a correspondence, there's a deep connection between Israel and the Messiah. And I think that's obvious throughout all the scriptures, and especially in Isaiah, of course, but also in the lives of the patriarchs and the life of Joseph. So we're going to focus more on Joseph as a parallel connection to the nation. But certainly there's such a strong message of Yeshua and his heart and his purposes of reconciliation for his brothers in this story. And I suppose we'll touch on that a little bit. Okay, well, you know the story. I'm presuming you know the story of Joseph, the youngest, no, not quite the youngest, second youngest son of Jacob. And still, there's quite an age gap between him and his older brothers. And Papa's favorite. And he has these dreams about his brothers bowing down to him, and his brothers and his mother and his father bowing down to him, and everybody's indignant, especially his brothers. They're off tending their father's flocks. Actually, he catches up with his brothers in Galilee. It's not clear from the story, it talks about Dothan, and where is that? Well, that's actually quite far north. I believe they're down in the south, and he heads up all the way into Galilee, and his brothers say, oh, here comes that dreamer. And there's some thoughts about killing him, but in the end, God intervenes, I believe, and he is sold into slavery to some traders who take him down to Egypt. And as far as the brothers are concerned, that's the end of Joseph. So much for the dreamer and us bowing down to him. We sure showed him. Of course, God had other plans. And one of the things that is very apparent in the story is this phrase, and I'm going to share my screen here. And I think this is important with respect to the nation, even when the nation is in exile. What do we read about what happens when Joseph goes down to Egypt? And the Lord was with Joseph. He becomes a slave, of course, in the house of Potiphar, and he rises to prominence as his manager. And we realize it's not just because he's a capable young man, but because the Lord was with him and made him successful. And despite his success, despite doing a good job for Potiphar, despite staying true to his master and staying true to his God and warding off the advances of Potiphar's wife, which you have to think was, that was quite an impressive thing for, I would think, a very, very lonely young man who could have really been feeling sorry for himself. But he says to Potiphar's wife, how could I sin against God by doing this? He was very, very conscious of the Lord and the Lord's standards of righteousness and holiness. So he does the right thing, and what happens? He ends up in prison. And what do we read about what happens when he's in prison? The Lord was with Joseph. And even in the prison, he rises to prominence. And the jailer, really looks upon him with favor and gives him a lot of responsibility and understands there's something special about this young man. So let's look at a little bit his life story here. Well, maybe he was a bit, well, let's just say unwise in how he related these dreams. I mean, God gave him these dreams to show him that he was going to rise to this place of prominence among his brothers. But maybe he was digging it a little bit. Yeah, I'm reading a little bit between the lines. He didn't really do anything wrong. Maybe he wasn't so wise about how he presented this material. Maybe not the most humble. Nevertheless, not the kind of offense that should result in him being sold into slavery. And then when he's in slavery, he makes the most of it. And what happens for all, the good things he does in Potiphar's house, he ends up in prison. He keeps doing what's right, and it seemingly everything going wrong. But we read that the Lord was with him. And I think when we consider the nation of Israel, even when they're in exile for their own failures, the promise is, I will never leave you or forsake you. And God is with the nation even in exile. The Lord never abandons the people. In fact, in the book of Ezekiel, there's this incredible image, of the glory of the Lord leaving the temple. I believe it's Ezekiel chapter 10. You have the vision, and he sees the glory of the Lord rising and leaving, departing from the temple. But where is the glory of the Lord? Where to go? Well, in Ezekiel chapter 1, where does he see the glory of the Lord? He says, I was with the exiles by the river Chavar, and there he saw the glory of the Lord. The Lord, actually, the glory of the Lord's presence departs from the temple and leaves, but goes to be with Israel in exile. And of course, later we see when the temple is restored, we see the glory returning back. But that's also telling us, just like the Lord was with Joseph, the Lord is with his people Israel, even in exile, and never leaves, and is always at work to fulfill his purposes. There's another thing here that we need to consider with respect to the people of Israel and exile. We're going to get into this a little bit more when we talk about the covenant expectations and the blessings and the curses and the consequences of disobedience being exile. That's we're coming to that. We're not there yet. Certainly, there is a very clear message to Israel that the consequence for disobedience ultimately is exile. And we were talking about Jacob last week, and how, he didn't exactly do right when he came and lied to his father 3 times. And actually, after the message, Pastor Joe and I were talking, and he was sort of pushing back about. I appreciate what Joe, you were saying. The message I was giving, that in a sense, Jacob reflects Israel being sent out of the land for disobedience, because Joe was telling me that he's heard messages where preachers have just, pounded really strongly on the wickedness of Jacob. Excuse me, I think I said Joseph before. We're talking about Jacob here. Jacob, for his failures, his lying to his father, and his deception, he's sent away. And certainly that echoes or parallels Israel for disobedience being banished. But he's heard messages where preachers have really, really seized on this, and we're making such a strong point about how wicked Jacob was. And almost, when you hear how wicked Jacob is, it's, Jacob, Israel, there can be a tinge of anti-Semitism in maybe some people's exuberance. I don't know. I want to be careful not to assume, but nevertheless, I think this is what Joe was picking up, and it bothered him a little bit when he'd hear these messages, and I can understand that. Okay. However, when we look at Joseph and going into exile, we see another very important thing about the consequences experienced by the people of Israel. Like Joseph, punishment for the people of Israel is not always because of disobedience. We need to be very careful about this. And let me just share my screen again, and I want to show you, I think, something we really need to take to heart with respect to why the Jewish people have suffered as much as they have. This is from Psalm 44, talking about how things have really gone wrong for the people. But look what it says here in verse 17. All this has come upon us, though we have not forgotten you. We have not been false to your covenant. Our heart has not turned back, nor our steps departed from your way. Yet you've broken us in the place of jackals and covered us with the shadow of death. If we'd forgotten the name of our God or spread our hands to a foreign God, would not God discover this? For he knows the secrets of the heart. Yet for your sake, we are killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. And it's interesting. If you read all of Psalm 44, it's talking about how Israel is suffering under tremendous consequences. And actually, some of the things that have come upon Israel are what you'd expect as the consequences for disobedience. There's a parallel in Psalm 44 to some of the curses that you read about in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, which are very clear. If you do this, this is the consequence. But in Psalm 44, it's all this has come upon us, but we've been true to the covenant. We have not lifted our hands to a false god. And the psalmist is saying, why is this happening to us despite our faithfulness? And here's the thing. And here's actually how Israel and Yeshua, there is a part of the connection with respect to suffering, is sometimes Israel suffers not for disobedience, but for obedience. Because they've been true, they suffer. And so we need to be very careful when we look at the history of the Jewish people, not to be so quick to judge. Yes, there is a very clear expectation of judgment for disobedience, but all the suffering of the Jewish people can't be brought back into their own lap. It's because you did this, you wicked Jacob. Sometimes it's the wickedness of others that results in Israel suffering, just like Yeshua, who did no wrong, also suffered, not of course for his sin, but for the sins of others, and because of the sins of others. And Psalm 44 tells us this, and the story of Joseph tells us this too. He does what's right with Potiphar's wife and ends up in prison. Sometimes doing the right thing means you're going to suffer. And actually, that's true for all of us, right? Yeshua tells us, expect persecution, not for your disobedience, but for obedience. And if we consider it, And I like to talk to people about this when we consider the Holocaust. I mean, you know, such a tremendous, horrible, terrible, terrible consequence upon the Jewish people. Please consider, if the Jewish people had been completely unfaithful and forsaken God, they would have just assimilated into the nations. And there would, you know, and those, the you know, the generations that followed, they wouldn't have suffered for being Jews. But actually, throughout most of the last 2,000 years, I would say, most of the suffering of the Jewish people is because of their faithfulness, because they refused to abandon their identity and the commandments of God, and have, you know, as not perfectly, but still have, you know, been faithful to be who God called Jewish people to be. And because of that, others have looked at them with contempt and hatred even. And so sometimes the suffering of the Jewish people is on account of disobedience, and we're going to talk about that when we get to the expectations and the blessings and curses in the Torah. But sometimes, as we read in Psalm 44, it's because of doing what is right. And we see this with Joseph, don't we? He does what is right, and continually he is ending up in difficulty. But nevertheless, just like the Jewish people, we read about Joseph, and God was with him. And even in exile, even when it is for disobedience, the Lord never leaves the Jewish people. He never forsakes them. He's always with them. And dear brothers and sisters, we all can relate to this, because there are times when we are disobedient too. And yet the Lord never leaves us or forsakes us. His love for us is always firm and consistent, and he's always seeking a way for reconciliation and for us to come back and return. That is the heart of our Father. Praise the Lord. Okay, so here is Joseph. You know the story. He ends up in jail, but then Pharaoh has a dream, and in the end, he is taken from the lowest place, a prisoner in the jail, to the highest place, the ruler of Egypt under Pharaoh. And of course, this is also parallel to Yeshua, who took the lowest place and is exalted to the highest place. The parallels are very evident. But then there are the brothers. And you know the story, the latter part of the story of Joseph, after he becomes ruler of Egypt, is all about this reconciliation with the brothers. And this is a part of return. We need to see that, and we're going to look at this in quite a bit of detail in the latter stages of our of this series, that return is not just about moving from, you know, point A to point B. It's not just from exile in the diaspora to the, you know, the furthest corners of the planet back to the land, though this is important. And this is still God's promise to the Jewish people. But return is aliyah, it's to go up. And the sense of going up is also the sense of spiritual restoration. And we see this in the story of Joseph, particularly the story of Joseph and his brothers, where it starts off also that things don't look like they're going so well, does it? But let's take a look. I just want to show that the brothers behaved very wickedly, but they still had a consciousness of sin, of what they had done. And these many years later, they still recognized that there was something they had done terribly wrong that had created such a problem in their family. And when all these bad things started happening to them, when they met this ruler of Egypt who they didn't recognize, and they said to one another, "In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, and that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us." They didn't have regard for their brother, and they didn't recognize God's calling on their brother. And of course, we can see the tremendous connection here between Yeshua and his people, Israel. He came into his own, and his own did not recognize him, did not receive him. And we see such a clear parallel in the story of Joseph and his brothers, that his brothers, when they encounter him the first time, they don't recognize him. And he speaks to them through an interpreter. And, I presume Joseph looks exactly like every other Egyptian. He doesn't look like a Hebrew from Canaan. He looks like an Egyptian. And what they see is an Egyptian ruler, not a brother. And isn't that amazing? Of course, this is, for most of the Jewish people, when you ask who is Jesus, he's the God of the Gentiles. He's not, the Jewish people don't see Yeshua as their brother, their leader, their Messiah, their king, but rather somebody who the Gentiles worship. And they see him almost like the brothers saw Joseph, in the garb of a Gentile. That's a tremendous parallel in the story. But of course, when they meet their brother the second time, things change. And they're still in distress when he reveals himself to them. So let's look at the story once again. And I really love this. Joseph puts the pressure on them about, he's going to keep his younger brother Benjamin and send them back to Jacob. Could you imagine what that would have been like? And they're like, "This can't be happening. Why is this happening? This is the absolute worst outcome that could possibly happen. How can we go back to our father when he wouldn't give us Benjamin to come with us? And finally we persuaded him, and now we're going to go back without him. He won't survive." And they're pleading. And particularly Judah makes the case and explains to this ruler, like, "Please let me take the lad's spot, because our father won't be able to endure us coming back without him." And I assume Joseph is doing a remarkable job of self-control and restraint. Can you imagine the emotions? And then we read he could not control himself anymore. And he had everyone else leave. And when he was just with his brothers, he made himself known to them. And he wept aloud. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. What a shocker that was. And of course, we're going to get into this later, because when we talk about the return story, yes, I'm focusing on the Jewish people and all of us, our return story, but the big return story is Yeshua's return story. He just like the patriarchs have a return story, Yeshua, of course, has this great return story. His is a little different than everybody's. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Of course, we're going to talk about his return story, and the Joseph story parallels Yeshua's story, as we'd mentioned earlier. But I guess one of the things I want to focus on here is that return is not just, as I said, a geographical move back to the land, but a restoration. And a restoration of relationship. And here are brothers being reconciled. At first, it's a shock. And Joseph, with nevertheless, despite everything his brothers have done to him, still has this heart of compassion for them. And he can't take it anymore. And he, with tears, cries out to them, "I am Joseph," and they are dismayed. And well, what a beautiful story. What an incredible story this is. And I love this next line. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And this is really the heart of God, isn't it? Reconciliation, restoration. Joseph is the one saying, "Come near me. I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here." Wow. "For God sent me before you to preserve life." Incredible. But I love this line, "Come near me." And that really is God's heart for the Jewish people. And, I think in some ways, because of all the difficulties the Jewish people have faced over the millennia, there is, in a sense, this, it's his longing to gather them, but all according to the pattern, according to his purposes. And even, we're going to get into this, even the disobedience of the Jewish people, in a sense, yes, they're responsible. We're all responsible for our own choices. But in the sense, their disobedience is something that God used. And even I would go so far as, this is a bit difficult, God, he didn't make them disobedient, but when you choose people to be the people of God who are sinners, guess what's going to happen? They're going to disobey. God knew all this. And all this is part of God's plan to bring reconciliation, restoration for the Jewish people and for all humanity. We can't get into this part quite yet. That's for a later session, but Israel's disobedience fits in with and is according to God's plan for the reconciliation of the whole world. And of course, Romans 11 deals very, very extensively with this. And but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Nevertheless, the point is aliyah, restoration. It's not just geographic, though that's important. It's not just a land issue, though that is important. It's also this way. And it's a reconciliation this way between brothers, between all of us, the estrangement that we all face in our banishment from the oneness that originally was ours in the garden. Well, okay, so moving on, just one more slide to just express the divine sovereign purposes of God with this. Of course, we read about this in Genesis 50. The brothers are still not sure of Joseph's heart to them and intentions. That when their father Jacob had died, he said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for the evil we did to him." And then later on in the chapter, Joseph says to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." And thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. In the end, the story of the Jewish people, despite disobedience, and again, I want to make it clear that Israel is no more disobedient than any other nation. If God had chosen any other people to be his people and had given them his laws, the outcome would have been the same, because Israel and every other people on the face of the planet were all sinners. And that's Paul's point in Romans 3, when he says all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. He's trying to say Jews and Gentiles, nobody is exempt from this. We're all sinners. And but by choosing the one nation, sinners though they are, and knowing that the outcome of all this is going to be their failure and their inability to live up to the standards for themselves as chosen people, because they are sinners and needed a savior like everyone else, the outcome of that would be salvation for many, many others. And that's what Paul says in Romans 11. Their failure, their sin meant salvation for the nations. Romans 11:11. We'll talk about that later. So the story of Joseph is also a story of reconciliation, or a story of reconciliation between brothers, a story of things seemingly going bad, but in the sovereign purposes of God, bringing about an ultimately good outcome. And there's another connection here that relates back to return to the land. Joseph, he's exiled, not because he did anything wrong, but he's taken into slavery and has many, many difficulties in the land of exile in Egypt. But God is with him. And despite being in exile, God blesses him and uses him for salvation of the nation of Israel, the saving of many lives, the lives of Egyptians too. And then Joseph, when he's about to die, as the writer of Hebrews says, by faith, Joseph made mention of his bones. He tells his brothers that I'm about to be gathered to my fathers, but afterwards, God will visit you and bring you from this place. And when he does, take my bones with you. Let's look at the scripture here. This is at the end of Genesis 50. Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. And then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. Now remember, and we're actually going to talk about this next session. God told Abraham hundreds of years before this event that he would inherit the land, but his descendants would be strangers in a strange land for 400 years, and afterwards they would return to the land God promised to Abraham. And here is Joseph, and he is referring back to this promise, which we'll look at extensively next time in Genesis 15. But he's saying there is this promise that the nation here in Egypt is it's only for a season, and it's all in God's sovereign plan that as a people we will return to the land God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when that happens, take my bones with you. And Joseph, in a sense, is a link between the patriarchs and the nation. You know, we start with one man, Abraham, and then there's Abraham's family. And when we get to Jacob and his 12 sons and their offspring, we now have this clan. And in Egypt, they continue to expand into tribes, and together 12 tribes, a nation. But Joseph is from the clan generation, the 70. They're not a nation, they're a clan of people. They're a family that has emerged into this clan, this tribe of Israel, if you will, that expands into 12 tribes. But of all the patriarchs of his generation, remember he's one of 11 sons. He's the only one that travels back with the nation to the land of Israel. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, all of them, they all die in Egypt. But Joseph's bones return with the nation. So let's go back to this slide. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. This is Exodus, as they're departing Egypt. For Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. Just as we'd read in Genesis 50, we read in Exodus 13. And then we read at the end of the book of Joshua, as for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem, in the piece of land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. And it became an inheritance of, hang on here, I have to move this. Inheritance of the descendants of Joseph. Okay, what's the significance of this? I think part of the significance of this is seeing the continuation and the continuity and the connection between the patriarchs and the nation, that Joseph's bones, Joseph, the one who preserved the nation from starvation and provided for the nation a place in the diaspora in Egypt, outside of the land of promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the one who provides this place for them, but at the right time, he goes back with the people and they receive their inheritance. And when we consider the story of Joseph, it's very much a story telling us about the sovereign plan of God, that despite hardships, despite difficulties, despite sins and sinful behavior, in the end, God's purposes are fulfilled. And also this connection to the promise. The promise was made to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. To your descendants, I give this land. And as they return, they carry the bones of one of the patriarchs with them. this deep connection back to this promise. And Joseph is buried in the plot of land that Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. So it's a very beautiful ending to the story. The story doesn't just end with the reconciliation. The story ends with the return back to the land. And the Joseph story connects Aliyah in the two dimensions, the vertical dimension going back, the horizontal dimension going back to the land. Joseph's bones go with them. And the vertical dimension, this restoration and reconciliation and forgiveness of sins. All part of the grand design of Aliyah, and speaks very powerfully of God's ultimate purposes for Israel, the Jewish people, and the nations of the world. All right, so next time we will we're going to begin to look at the Exodus, but in order to understand the Exodus, we first have to look backwards and go back to the story of Abraham. So until next time, God bless you. Thank you so much for your attention, and we will continue on exploring the wonderful, glorious story of return that's throughout the scriptures. Amen. See you next time.